everyone, and welcome to Mintcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Adli, founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. Now, to help us continue these interviews, we invite you to become a member on our Patreon page, which we'll link in the video below. As an independent media watchdog outlet that exposes the corruption of the ruling class and the attacks on our civil liberties, we are facing major censorship and shadow banning by social media tech giants. And that's why we also ask for you to share our videos and help fund our projects as we stand up to the war machine. So let's get right to it. Today, we'll be joined by Mint Press News senior staff writer, MacLeod, who recently uncovered for Mint Press an imperial regime change NGO that acts very similarly to the CIA. You've probably never even heard of it. It's called Creative Associates International. Now, Creative Associates International is part of a worldwide network of soft power institutions that serve the purpose of regime change for US empire. Creative Associates has played a huge role in privatizing Iraq. It designed messenger apps meant to overthrow the government of Cuba. It has even served as a front group for the infamous Blackwater mercenary force and has liaisoned with the Contra death squads in Nicaragua. Yet very few people know about the organization. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's good to be with you. How are you?
Very good. First, I'd like you to tell us more about who Creative Associates International is, how it was formed, and why we should know about them today.
Sure. Well, I guess if you go to Creative Associates International, their webpage, you'll see pictures of smiling African kids being taught English in school classrooms. You'll see Latino farmers bringing in their harvest. You'll see girls in Asia going to school. And you get the impression from looking at that website that they're a very progressive charity that's based on development and compassion. But when you start digging even just a little bit deeper, it starts to become a bit more murky. For instance, on its About Us section of their website, it says that they provide outstanding on-the-ground development services which forge partnerships to deliver sustainable solutions to global challenges. Now, as if that's any sort of answer to who are you. They go on to say, Creative is recognized in the field for its ability to quickly adapt and excel in conflict and post-conflict environments. And that sounds an awful lot like how Blackwater, the infamous mercenary group, describes itself. And so really, when I started looking at this, I started thinking, is this like a fluffy, progressive charity, or is this some sort of like regime change operation? And really, it's a little of column A and a little of column B. As you said in the intro, they've in their past, they've helped liaise with the Contras, the famous death squads in Nicaragua. Also in Pakistan, their office was used as a front for Blackwater, which used it to conduct raids along the Afghan-Pakistan border. And they were also used in Iraq and Afghanistan to privatize those countries' education systems and really turn them over to US businesses. So really, I think if you do ask, who is Creative Associates, I think you can basically put them in the same sort of category as so many of these NGOs and semi-governmental organizations which are located around DC. I mean, Creative Associates, just their personal history, they were started in the 1970s by a very wealthy Bolivian whose parents left the country because of the progressive revolution that was going on there. And they moved to the United States. And very quickly, Creative became a very large company indeed, employing over 1,000 people and contracting many thousands more. And right now, they say on their website that they're working in at least 85 countries, and it's likely that that's actually even more. So they have an enormous web of contacts and power around the world. But nobody's really talking about them. I think I'm the first person who's really done an in-depth dive into what they're doing into more than one country. And so really, I think more people should be looking at this.
And so I want to talk about what they've done in Iraq. You've written very extensively about their background and their history. They obviously present themselves as a progressive, empowering charity, which is basically how most of these NGOs present themselves to the public. I mean, you mentioned when you go on their website, they've got these smiling children in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, harvesting their crops and stuff like that. I mean, that kind of reminds me of just like how the neoliberal establishment really view themselves as empowering people in the global South. And so Iraq is obviously a country that the United States has occupied um, for decades, right? And we have the largest US embassy is in Iraq. Talk to me about what they've done in the country of Iraq.
Yeah, sure. So in Iraq, of course, the society was completely devastated in the early 2000s by the US invasion. And the US is still there. And that basically means they call the shots with regards to what happens in Iraqi society, where money goes. And Creative Associates has come along and been the architect of the Iraqi education system. There's only really one person who's really looked into this in great detail. That's Kenneth Saltman of the University of Illinois. And he describes it as a classic example of disaster capitalism, which means that, whenever some sort of terrible event occurs, like a hurricane, big corporations and the government move in and start enacting laws which they normally couldn't pass. But because everybody's in shock, they managed to ram these things through. Something like this happened with Hurricane Katrina, where in New Orleans, their school system was privatized. Other things, the Patriot Act in the wake of September 11th are also seen as these examples of disaster capitalism. Anyway, Saltman says that Creative Associates really remodeled Iraqi society based on a radical free market experiment that was hell-bent on demolishing the public sector and shifting control of civil society and, society more generally, completely over to the private sector. And that is a private company that takes its orders from Washington. And he quotes, and he says, and I directly quote him here, that this was essentially an attempt to hand a nation over to corporations. What Creative Associates have done has been to rewrite Iraqi textbooks and Afghan textbooks, because they're doing this in Afghanistan as well. For instance, they managed to just cut the last 40 years of Afghan history from the school's curriculum, so the Taliban are not even mentioned in Afghan textbooks. And one American educator said that you can't buy that kind of thought control unless you have a few $100 million. And so ultimately, while Creative is making enormous profits and even gaining plaudits for doing this education work in Iraq, there is a more subtle and nefarious undercurrent running through all this.
Okay, and then you discussed that Creative Associates is actually part of a think tank industrial complex. You mentioned that they're privatizing these education industries in Iraq and Afghanistan, and other industries too, that are lining the pockets of people in Washington, D.C. Explain to us this system of the think tank industrial complex that Creative Associates is part of.
Yeah, so I'm referencing the military industrial complex, which is what President Eisenhower talked about in his address to the US nation when he was leaving office. He warned America that there was this new network of huge weapons contractors that were essentially calling the shots in Washington and leading to a situation where the United States would feel trapped into forever wars, which were helping no one except shareholders in companies like Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics or Northrop Grumman. And something quite similar is happening now in the US with this think tank industrial complex. So much of what the CIA did covertly is now done pretty much openly by semi-private companies that are based in New York or DC. If you go to the suburbs of DC, a lot of people call it Raytheon Acres, the Virginia and Maryland. There are a bunch of huge offices staffed with people who are essentially deciding health or education or economic policy across the world. And that's what Creative Associates is really part of, these sort of think tanks really got in on the development and redevelopment game, first in Serbia, where the US bombed the country in 1999, and then helped to engineer the ouster of President Milosevic. And then they really hit the jackpot in Iraq and Afghanistan, where trillions of dollars have been spent on those wars, including billions upon billions on reconstruction, most of which tends to be decided by US-based firms and not, the Iraqi government or the Afghan government. So that's why it's really not a democratic endeavor, these sort of think tanks, because they do not shift power and decision-making over to local people in their communities. What happens is bigwigs in Washington or New York or London or wherever they're based still get to call the shots, and they get to redesign much of the world. And so really, this is a new form, I would argue, of a very sort of creeping imperialism, where these companies present themselves as being these progressive champions of, say, women's rights or, empowering children or local minority groups. But in fact, what they're doing is they're being very careful to design societies in a way that is much more conducive to US interests than most people realize.
Okay, so talk to us a little bit about how they design these societies. I mean, what is the thought process behind this? Obviously, it's for profit, but like, what does this exactly like entail? And what does that look like?
Well, I guess Saltman says that a lot of the time these campaigns are directed against countries which have a very strong state sector historically, a lot of them, ex-Soviet countries perhaps. And the point is to try and really reorganize society around free market lines.
Yeah.
One example is in Haiti, where they have put in a lot of money, Creative Associates, into redesigning Haitian journalism. Um, Really trying to train hundreds of Haitians in the American model of journalism, which is all about, talking about objectivity and not bringing your own opinions into it. But what this was really doing is it's really an assault on Haiti's traditional journalism, which is really class-based, where people see journalists as representing either the elite or the people. And what the US is doing there is essentially flooding a certain sector of Haiti with plenty of money to establish these outlets as credible sources. And what that does is essentially attack the traditional outlets which have preached a more sort of radical message. And so ultimately, this is a process of defanging what's going on. And so, yeah, as I said, it's a very subtle way of enacting change in societies and also making sure that other types of change become much less easy to undertake.
Okay, and what about you talk a lot about Cuba in your article as well. What has Creative Associates International done to kind of change up society within Cuba and to promote regime change?
Oh boy, I mean, they are infamous. I think if anybody's heard of Creative Associates, it's probably with regards to what they've done in Cuba. So, for instance, perhaps their most notorious mission was to create a Twitter-like app called Zunzunio, which they were paid for. They were paid by the USAID and other three-letter agencies in Washington to design this app, which was supposed to be an independent news and messaging app. The idea was behind it that they would start off with a very good and cheap service, which would immediately rise to prominence in Cuba and become a trusted source of news and a way to communicate. But then slowly over time, the idea was to start drip feeding anti-government slogans and messages into people's inboxes and news feeds. And then after a couple of years, it might seem like there's this big groundswell of anti-government activity, at which point Creative Associates was planning to basically start a color revolution via this app, which would tell everybody, go to the central square, we're all meeting there, down with the government, etc. This endeavor was actually exposed by the Associated Press in a long article in 2014. Creative Associates actually tried to get, and so did the US State Department, they tried to get Twitter's Jack Dorsey on board with this. They had a meeting with him. It's not known to what extent Jack was actually involved in this. I suspect probably very minimally, because only a little while after that meeting, they decided to can this project. But the fact that this was going on is quite frankly astonishing, especially when you consider that foreign interference in domestic elections or domestic society was such a huge issue in the 2010s. People were always talking in the US about Russian interference and how it was an absolute affront to democracy. And yet, when you look at what Russia is accused of doing, it really
Right.
only like goes to about 1/100th of what Creative Associates was actually doing in Cuba.
That's
And
why
that's only
that's why I'm laughing.
yeah, and that's only one story. I mean, Creative Associates also
Right.
created a phony HIV/AIDS awareness drive in Cuba. They were able to fly operatives from all around Latin America to the island, and their excuse, they said, perfect excuse, which is in their internal documents, which was released. This was just this great idea, which allowed their operatives to move around Cuba and try to find people and groups that they could liaise with to try to ultimately overthrow the Cuban government, which has been the goal of the US since 1959. I mean, Fidel Castro has apparently survived over 600 assassination attempts from the US. And then, of course, Creative Associates also is behind a lot of the discord within the hip hop community in Cuba as well. So, Creative Associates hired a Serbian promoter who had been part of this color revolution against Slobodan Milosevic 20 years ago. Um, what they did was they flew him out. He started his own company called Canvas, and he was really, this head honcho and really kind of thinking about the new sort of color revolutions which are going on. He was in the pay of the US government. He was flown to Latin America, and the whole point was that he was trying to find local rappers and artists which he could use to try to further anti-government messages. And how he did this was, he went around, he found some people, and then he basically flashed the cash in Latin America by bribing quite well-known artists or rappers from other parts of Latin America to allow his men to go on tour with them or to open up for them, which gave them credibility. And then Zunzunio, this app, this Twitter clone, was then used to promote these rappers to make it seem like everybody in Cuba was talking about them, when in fact they had essentially no organic following whatsoever, but they were just being pushed because they were willing to spread a political message which was conducive to what the CIA and to what people in Washington wanted. And that really kind of begs the question, were these 2021 July protests, which were immediately led by the hip hop community, was that part of Creative Associates' remit as well? If you go to their website, you'll see that even though they say, oh, we've worked in at least 85 countries, if you type in Cuba, there isn't a single word about that island on its website, despite the fact that, they've been exposed worldwide as having worked on the island for years. So, it does kind of beg the question of whether Creative Associates or these rappers that were leading the protests were kind of working in hand in hand with the US government.
Okay, Alan, let's talk about the Cuban protests that took place just a couple of weeks ago that completely overtook all headlines in the United States. That basically resulted in the United States to slap Cuba with additional sanctions just actually this week. How did CAI influence those protests?
Well, the short answer is we don't know, but there are a lot of interesting leads to look at. As I said before, CAI had been absolutely integral into the mission into try to getting the hip hop community in Cuba on board with the US regime change agenda. Cuban hip hop really became very important and well listened to on the island in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was really used as a vehicle for social commentary. A lot of Afro-Cubans in particular used it to talk about issues which are kind of taboo in Cuba, like, for instance, racial disparities and economic injustice between Afro-Cubans and white Cubans, which they are very real. But the US really saw this as a way to, drive further discord and division among Cubans, and they wanted to use it as a wedge issue. And so, as I said before, CAI was used in the late 2000s and early 2010s to recruit Cuban rappers to this cause. And really, since then, Cuban rap has been kind of on the downhill because a lot of people tend to associate it with this, crazy anti-government conspiracy that's just going on. But yeah, the July protests were very interesting. They started off in a small town in the west of Cuba. And then almost immediately, even if you read corporate media accounts in the US, they were signal boosted by people in Miami. And within hours, even the president of the United States was talking about everybody should get on the streets and we should defend the rights of Cubans to peacefully protest. This thing, it seems, never really got beyond a few hundred people in Havana and other cities protesting, but it was presented as if this was, the thing that was happening in the world. There was a lot of talk about police brutality, but the actual shots of what was going on there, the video images showed that it was really quite lightly policed. Immediately, Cuban rappers came to the fore and started leading these protests. There was, in particular, quite a famous rapper called Yo2L, who now lives in Spain, who became kind of an unofficial leader. He led a big sympathy protest in Miami. His song Patria y Vida became kind of an unofficial anthem for the protests and was even being tweeted out by people like Samantha Power and the Western Hemisphere Secretary, what was her name? Chang, I think her name is. Uh, what was going on there? I mean, this guy is clearly being hothoused and bred for this position. And this is really on the basis of what CAI has been doing clandestinely for years. And so it leads a lot of Cubans to think, was this completely astroturf from the beginning? Or did the US government jump on a natural protest which happened? Because obviously there are serious problems in Cuba, especially after the COVID crisis, which has destroyed their economy because it's based on tourism and nobody's coming. But yeah, certainly a lot of Cubans are scratching their heads and thinking, to what extent was the US government involved in this? And if the US government was involved, it's pretty likely CAI was as well.
Well, and I think that begs the next question, which is, is Creative Associates International, can we consider it a private company or can we consider it an arm of the US government? How intertwined is it with the US government?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I mean, they are a private company in the sense that they are a for-profit company, which seems to make quite a lot of money. Um, However, when you look at some of the aspects of the company, maybe it seems to get a little bit more difficult to tell the difference between private and public. For instance, their headquarters is in Chevy Chase, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., where a lot of the big think tanks and big weapons companies also have their headquarters. It's colloquially known as Raytheon Acres. When you have a look at their board, 6 of the 7 people on their advisory board are high US officials, including a US general who was in charge of Central Asia, including Afghanistan. They also have the former head of USAID, Andrew Natsios, on their board as well. And, Natsios kind of gave the game away when Trump was planning on cutting funding for USAID. He said, and I quote, "What you're basically doing is eviscerating the most important tool of American influence in the developing world, which is our development program. I don't think they understand what the role of USAID is, what USAID's mission directors are, and USAID's mission directors are among the most influential foreigners in the country," he said. So that's really, it's kind of a way of really looking into their mind that they see USAID as really performing this soft power role.
And are
And
they,
furthermore,
and I don't mean to interrupt you, did you say they are funded by USAID?
yeah, that's right. Virtually all of their funding, Creative
Okay.
Associates, comes from USAID. They've taken $2 billion of government contracts in the last couple of decades, 1.8 billion of which comes from USAID, which, as a lot of people watching this will know, was created by the Reagan administration as a direct front for the CIA. In fact, the co-founder of USAID, Alan Weinstein, said, a lot of what we do openly was done covertly by the CIA 25 years ago. And so, yeah, the fact that this company is taking virtually all of its money from the US government, most of the senior people in its organization are former government higher ups. The fact that it's headed in Washington and works hand in hand with the CIA and other intelligence groups, strongly suggests that really this is kind of a company that's being deliberately held at arm's length for the convenience of the US government.
And this, then that would also mean that this is funded through our taxpayer money if it's funded through USAID. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100%. That's right. And then they're not only doing this stuff, and then they're making profit off of it as well.
Okay, let's talk about some other countries. I mean, you talked a little bit about Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti. Obviously, much of their presence has been in Cuba. What do you think about, what other countries have they been actively involved in that we can talk about today?
Well, one of them might be Nicaragua, for instance. They've had a long history in that country, the Central American country. If you go back to the 1980s, Nicaragua was controlled by the left-wing Sandinistas, the anti-imperialist, probably semi-Marxist force that was the government there. And the US was throwing tons of money into death squads to try to overthrow the government and bring about the return of the Somoza dictatorship or something similar. And the US government stopped funding the Contras in 1989. And almost immediately afterwards, Creative Associates International began working in Nicaragua with the Contras. Now, to be fair, they do say that all they were doing was actually offering these former rebels education opportunities, things like that, to try to, ease them back into civilian life. But what also seems to have been going on was an attempt to unite the various forces of the conservative opposition together to try to defeat the Sandinistas electorally. Um, Election laws about foreign funding foreign government funding were kind of circumvented by Creative Associates International by setting up these kind of little NGOs, which, officially work with everyone, but, frankly, in practice are only working with the elite or with groups that the US government wants them to work with in the first place. And, ultimately, if that was their goal, they succeeded because in 1990, Nicaragua, after years of punishing sanctions, eventually ended up voting for Violeta Chamorro, who was the US government's preferred candidate. And then they had, over a decade of rule by this Chamorro dynasty. And so, CAI, I'm trying to say CAI, not CIA. It's very similar, not just linguistically. But I think they have proved absolutely just a fantastic tool for the US government all around the world.
I want to go back to Afghanistan because right now Afghanistan is a big hot topic in the news with the US military leaving the Kabul airport and just all of these scenes and imagery that is coming out. How has Creative Associates International played a role in Afghanistan from the very beginning? I know you mentioned that they rehauled much of their education system, to not even mention the Taliban, which is so incredible because the Taliban has played such an integral role in part of their modern history. What else can we see that Creative Associates International has done in Afghanistan?
Yeah, they've mostly been working either in construction or education, but it's important to note that even though they're getting these very large contracts, I know that they've managed to get hundreds of millions of dollars worth of contracts from the NED and USAID in Afghanistan, that a lot of that money just goes straight back to the US and never leaves America in the first place, because Creative Associates has to have security, and so they hire Blackwater, or now they're called Academy, but US security groups. Um, and this whole grift just goes on through Afghanistan. I've got this new piece coming out, which is specifically about how much money has been wasted in Afghanistan. And it is just astonishing, the grift of a lot of these companies who have been feeding from the trough of the US government, who have been splashing billions upon billions of dollars into all these phony or ridiculous or quixotic reconstruction efforts, whether it's infrastructure or whether it's schools and universities or hospitals, etc., which have basically come to nothing. And CAI has been really a central part of that. They've, together with Iraq, those two countries have really been the lion's share of their contracts throughout the years. Generally, they tend to hire locals to do the actual teaching because it's very dangerous for Westerners to be there. But yeah, ultimately they're taking, considerable profits out of this system. And as I said, they're part of this NGO think tank industrial complex, which has really arisen and are, these are really some of the strongest opponents against getting out of Afghanistan. And we've seen all of them talking in the corporate media over the last couple of weeks about how this is, such a terrible mistake and a quagmire that the United States, and a black mark against Joe Biden, and why aren't we standing up for the women and children there? Kind of ignoring the fact that very little has been done for women and children in Afghanistan over the last 20 years of US rule.
And so what other think tanks, NGOs act in tandem or very similarly to CAI?
There's kind of a spectrum of these companies, I guess. You know, in the 2000s, everybody was talking about Halliburton, which was Dick Cheney's operation, which was really mostly concerned with energy and oil, whereas CAI is more concerned with education and infrastructure. Of course, there's Blackwater, which is much more of a security company. Of course, that's called Academy now. There are ones that are quite similar to CAI, like RTI International or Chemonics. But again, a lot of these groups are quite similar to the think tanks that populate DC and New York. These four-letter agencies like CSIS or CNAS, or the Brookings Institute, the Hudson Institute, or the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. All of these groups, pump out either reports saying, hey, we think the US should invade this country, or it's crazy to think about, reducing the military budget here. And so many of them are actually being funded by the US government or by weapons contractors directly. So this is just a complete scam to try and fill our ears with this sort of nonsense, this pro-war propaganda. And the people who are really making a massive buck out of this are companies like CAI. If you go to Raytheon Acres in Virginia, one of the only successful reconstruction efforts over the past 20 years has actually been around there. That area there has changed remarkably over the last 2 decades. It's become extremely wealthy. If you had invested $10,000 in a company like Lockheed Martin in 2001, just before September 11th, you'd now be sitting on over $130,000 today. And so really, what I'm saying is even losing wars make money. And the people who are making money off of this are the think tank industrial complex like CAI, like RTI International, Chemonics, or the weapons companies themselves.
And so they're really behind drafting these policies that make it to the president's desk, making its way to politicians' desks to influence the way that they talk about war and policy. So how has this organization influenced, policies here in the United States?
Well, I'm not sure if CAI is specifically involved in influencing policy in that sense, but they're certainly interested in it. As I said, a lot of the people on their board are top politicians. There are mayors of important cities. There's former elected officials. There's ambassadors to different countries and generals. And certainly, if you look at groups like CNAS or CSIS or the Carnegie Endowment for Peace or the Council of Foreign Relations or the Atlantic Council. It's all of these groups that really are staffed by these people who are hot-housed in elite universities. Maybe they spend a couple of years in the military or working for some, lobbyist in DC. And then they start pumping out reports which are supposed to be expert reports about what the US needs to do either internally or in foreign policy. And really, when you look at them, it's always arguing for more war, more spending on the military, and just generally more hostilities around the world. And frankly, when you look at who is funding these companies, it's really no surprise that this is happening, because so often these think tanks are being funded by the likes of Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin, who are making billions and billions of dollars off the suffering of millions and millions of people around the world. people in the Middle East are paying for American wars in blood, whereas Americans are just paying for it for their tax dollars. But, if somebody's paying out, somebody else is getting rich, and it tends to be stockholders in these companies which profit off war. Obviously, groups like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon are kind of more more transparently egregious in the fact that they're actually selling the weapons. But groups like CAI are actually they're pretty much in the same business. They're pretty much, doing the same thing. If they're not actually pulling the trigger, they're the ones that are cleaning up the mess afterwards and sending the US an enormous bill for the pleasure.
That's incredible. I mean, this is an organization, like you said, that's so intertwined with the US government and the think tank industrial complex that might as well be called the CIA. I mean, it's very, very similar in the way that it is, uprooting societies, I think, in the global South and influencing the way the education system is written for children so that it could work in the benefit of Western imperialism and to promote regime change, as we've seen what CAI has done in Cuba. Alan MacLeod, thank you so much for joining us today. You guys can, for all those who have been listening and watching, you can find this investigation at mintpressnews.com. We're also going to link in it below the video. This interview is also going to be available in audio format in our SoundCloud account when you search for Mintcast. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today.
Good to be with you.